Hi, I'm Evan B. Howard, and I am here with a lecture on monasticism, a few wilder expressions. And I thought, since we were doing a little hiking and camping anyway, I couldn't think of a wilder place to film this video than up here at Clear Lake in Colorado. About as wild as you can get. Well, I mean, you could get to jungles and things like this, but this is a wilderness, so I hope you enjoy it. We certainly will today and tomorrow. Most often, when we think about monasticism, we imagine men or women in black robes chanting in a sanctuary somewhere. And that is a valid portrait, sort of. But then again, honestly, I don't think this is a fully accurate picture. In my lecture, What is Monasticism?, I explained that the term monk and other similar phrases actually were used from the beginning and actually can be used legitimately now, today, to identify a wide range of expressions of devotion to God. In that lecture, I stated that I would use the term religious life, which is the proper technical term for this phenomena, or I would just talk about monasticisms, to identify these various embodiments of religious consecration. In my lecture on forms of monasticism, I survey some of these different expressions as they were manifest in the earliest centuries of the development of religious life. There I talk about the sons and daughters of the covenant, 4th century Syrian Christians who served local congregations within the context of a special commitment of consecration to God. I describe the development of domestic asceticism, wherein women would practice some form of consecrated life within the context of their own homes, and at times even in the context of married life. I describe the wandering ascetics of Syria, Palestine, and elsewhere, who followed the example of Jesus, traveling from here to there, preaching and healing and things like that, with no possessions and no formal rule, but the leading of the Spirit. My point in describing these various diverse expressions was to suggest that what we think of as monasticism actually comes in a wide range of shapes and sizes. Indeed, Benedict himself, following the lead of others before him, got to put this on because of the wind, following the lead of others before him, identifies a number of different kinds of monks. But Benedict has nothing but criticism for all but a few authentic anchorites and the mass of monks living in what he thinks of as legitimate monastic communities. So then, I want to push back a bit. I am not actually entirely comfortable with Benedict's categories. And honestly, I don't think I am alone in my discomfort with the Benedictine model of monastic life. Indeed, and now we are getting closer to the point of this lecture today, there were a number of believers in Europe, particularly between the 12th and the 15th centuries, that devised and developed ways of living that were monastic, or at least semi-monastic, but they did not match the Benedictine model. They were, we might say, a bit wilder. Frankly, I think they were onto something in their wildness. And that brings me to the point of all this historical definition debate. My suspicion is that these fringe groups, relatively unknown and frequently neglected by some as being non-monastic, may actually be some of the closest parallels to what we think of and we see in front of us in new monasticism today. Thus, after providing a little historical background to these times in general, I will describe 4 distinct expressions of religious life. I intend to show how they individually and together explored forms of Christian life that, while not matching the Benedictine norm, sincerely and authentically sought to embody the ideals of consecrated life. And then, at the end, I will venture a few thoughts about their relevance for our own pioneering of new monasticism today. But first, the historical background. You must realize that the 13th through the 15th centuries were some very crazy times. Historian Barbara Tuchman, in her famous study, describes the center of this period as that calamitous 14th century, and for good reason. This was the time of the plague, which reduced the population of Europe by 50% by the end of the 14th century. This was the period of the 100 Years' War between 1356 and 1453, a war that shattered the previous medieval unity and forged the establishment of nations. This was the time when those jousting tournaments popularized a culture of violence and wherein the codes of chivalry and the ecclesiastical denunciations were unable to stem the tide of looting and fear. This was also a period of trouble within the church, when feuding popes ruled from different locations, when Rome issued interdicts, they were called them, requiring priests not to serve communion to their parishes within entire nations, when indulgences were sold to support corrupt officials, and when abbots, bishops, and princes all schemed together at the expense of the common believer. It was a time of great loss, great fear, and no place to trust. And yet, it was also a time when there was opportunity for the common person. Feudal economic boundaries were being shaken by the development of a new money economy. People were beginning to write in the vernacular rather than simply in Latin. This, along with other factors, made education more available to masses. And I could go on and on about this. Mind you, I am not presenting you the situation of the 16th century. The Western world was not ready for the reformations of that century, but it was getting ready. And that brings me to the history of monasticism. As you can imagine, there was a lot going on among religious folks, just as there was everywhere else. Now, just prior and early within this period, there was a movement of those who were interested in private contemplation. The large liturgical communities of the Cluniac Benedictine institution seemed overwhelming and perhaps not even faithful to Benedict. So, Camaldolese, Carthusians, Cistercians, all these groups, they developed new forms of re-embodying Benedict, and they brought in some interest in the early desert monastic life for a new European context. Later, anchoresses, like Julian of Norwich, then attached themselves as hermits, enclosing themselves in single rooms that were built alongside church buildings. You also have the development of independent hermits like Richard Rolle, who traveled around seeking God and writing classics like The Living Flame of Love. As common people began to read the Gospels in their own language, many were struck with the simple apostolic life of Jesus and his followers. They formed informal societies to consider what the vita apostolica, or the apostolic life, might look like in their own context. Some of these societies ultimately became recognized orders of the Roman Catholic Church. And I will discuss the mendicants, the Franciscans, Carmelites, Piet and Augustinian friars in a separate lecture. Others of these informal societies actually developed into movements such as the Cathars or the Waldensians, and ultimately were identified by the Roman Catholic Church as heresy. Indeed, the Dominicans kind of were developed in response to the Cathars. And yet, in between these two extremes of formally recognized religious orders on the one hand and heretical sects on the other, a few expressions emerged that skirted those boundaries. And they did so by reconstructing, shall we say, the accepted forms of monastic life. Their experiments, constantly on the edge of ecclesial acceptability, forged, in the context of extremes already presented, a new way of imagining consecrated life. I will describe in what follows 4 of these. The least known of these 4 were the humiliati. The humiliati, or the humble ones, first emerged in the 1170s in northern Italy. Early accounts describe both communities of clergy and associations of laypersons. In 1184, they were listed as heretics, but they appealed to authorities, and by 1201, they received official recognition. And by 1278, there were likely over 100 houses of humiliati in the region of Milan alone. Thus, by the 13th century, the mid-13th century, the humiliati had become a major presence in the religious, economic, and administrative life of northern Italy. Now, what is important to notice about the humiliati is their structure as a religious order. 3 distinct forms of religious life were approved in 1201 within a single framework of authority. Groups of clergy living in common, male or female religious living in communities, and more significantly for this lecture, less formal associations of men and women living a religious life while living in their own homes. This group was later known as the Third Order. A letter employed as evidence in the 1201 hearings gives us the best sense of the life of the Third Order humiliati. They are to pursue a life of virtue, and particularly the virtue of humility. Profits and produce collected beyond the just needs of the communities were to be given to the poor, for they were not to lay up treasures on earth, but rather lay them up in heaven. They are to fast on the 4th and the 6th day each week, except during feast seasons. 2 frugal meals are to be eaten each day outside of those fast days. They are to observe the canonical hours, reciting the full 7-fold divine office. Their clothing is neither to be too grand nor too abject. They are to come together each Sunday for a time of instruction and mutual support. You get the idea. Thus, what we see in the early humiliati is an informal and yet recognized society of marrieds and singles living in their own homes, yet with sufficient geographic proximity to gather on Sundays, making serious commitments to a life of devoted commitment to a religious life as individuals and as a community. They do not abandon all their possessions in the process of joining a monastery. They do not renounce their marriages, but maintain chastity within the context of married life. They have no formal abbess or abbot, but submit themselves willingly to the leadership of local bishops, maintaining patience in adversity and expressing the willingness to turn the other cheek, as they say, when offended by another. Is this monasticism or not? I mention the humiliati in part, because they precede another group that might be more familiar to you. Indeed, this latter group was accepted by the Church in 1221 and became a highly successful and popular movement in the 13th century, the Franciscan Third Order. Oh, by the way, First Order is the official order of men, monks. Second Order is the order of cloistered nuns, and third orders are lay people. So just to get the idea of first, second, and third. The original order of the Third Order, the original rule of the Third Order Franciscans is lost. But the story of Francis having compassion on one who desired to follow his ideals but could not live the life of celibacy and complete poverty is well known. Originally, Third Orders were societies of lay persons living in the world, but following a revised rule of life, adapted to one's situation but still closely connected with the main emphases of the rule of the Franciscan order and living under the guidance of a First Order superior. I remember Sherry and I in the early 1980s investigating the possibility of joining the Franciscan, what they call the secular Franciscans, it's a Franciscan Third Order, as Protestant evangelicals. Perhaps if circumstances were different, I might be a Franciscan today, married, working a secular job, and yet vowed to a life of simplicity, poverty, and humility, purity and humility for the rest of my life. Francis was a bit wild, a wandering preacher, and the history of Third Order Franciscans reflects some of that wildness. The third group I want to introduce was also a bit wild. The interest in the apostolic life was spreading all over Europe among men and women. Yet the style of compassionate ministry embodied so clearly in the Franciscan way was closed to women. The Church required that the Second Order Franciscans, also known as the Poor Clares, be confined within the cloister and give themselves to a life of prayer. Nevertheless, the origins of the Beguines, our third group, actually probably preceded Francis for a few years. It gets complicated. The woman to whom many Beguines identified as their first Beguine, but was clearly not the first, because like I said, it's complicated. Her name was Marie de Wany, Mary from Awany, near Brussels in Belgium. From her childhood, she was attracted to simplicity and refused the fine clothes her parents offered her. Her parents arranged that she would be married at age 14 to John, the son of another local wealthy family. After her marriage, she began to practice asceticism a bit more seriously. John also came to a deeper relationship with God, and they practiced the semi-monastic life together, fasting and spending their time in prayers, physical labor, and works of charity. She and John established an informal community near a group of lepers. John, at this point in time, seems to disappear from the story, but we hear instead of Marie's popularity growing exponentially. Even Francis of Assisi himself was said to be one of her admirers. She died in 1213, and her example stimulated a host of women's communities. It is difficult really to define Beguine because the word is used really to label a host of somewhat connected or similar expressions throughout Europe during this period of time. We do know, however, this much, that the Beguines were not nuns. Nuns rarely left their monastery grounds and lived under the authority of their abbess, who was in turn under the strict control of the local bishop. Beguines, however, were very active in their own neighborhoods, and the local bishop had no greater authority over the Beguines than he had over any other lay person in his diocese. They lived in self-supporting communities, paying taxes to the local government. They made no vow of stability, and thus they could make their own choices and join a different community or move somewhere else if they wished. Whereas European convents were usually located in the countryside, Beguinages were usually located in the cities wherein the women could ply their trades. Sometimes they would pool their resources to purchase homes, which would be used as a common gathering place and an apartment complex for some. Whereas the ardent Franciscan, interesting enough, renounced the money economy for the value of absolute economic abandonment to the hand of God, the Beguines, on the other hand, employed themselves for the sake of mutual support and serving the poor, making use of the money economy. Beguines operated schools, hospitals, and businesses. Beguinages were also informal and largely non-hierarchical. In many houses, the associates would gather regularly to discuss business and make decisions together, which in turn were supervised and administered by what was called a magistra, who was also then advised by a council of elder women. Each community devised its own rule, defining the common aspects of their life together, things like times of prayer, expectations of the members, and so on and so forth. But this rule that they had was, and it could be, and it actually was, revised when necessary. They shared periodic times of worship. Some of these Beguines became well-known mystical writers, such as Mechtild of Magdeburg, Hadewich, Beatrice of Nazareth, and Marguerite Porret, who ultimately actually was burned at the stake. So, that's the Beguines. My final example of the wilder side of monastic life is the brothers and sisters of the common life, also known as the Devotio Moderna, or the New Devotion. These communities developed a century later, the late 14th and early 15th centuries, in what is now Holland and northern Germany. Conscious of the difficulties that previous expectations of their kind had experienced with religious authorities, the New Devotion movement took great care for the most part to maintain their image of respectability, though they still were required to defend themselves on a number of occasions. You might know of this group best through a single book that was produced by one of their number, The Imitation of Christ, perhaps the most popular devotional book of all time. 4 characteristics identify this movement. First, they lived together and pooled their resources. This is where the name, Brothers and Sisters of the Common Life, appears. Second, although some of their members were ordained, they sought not to found new churches or religious orders, but simply to, quote, frequent devoutly their parish churches. They were, quote unquote, devout without being religious in the technical sense. One interpreter describes them as being part of a third or middle status between lay and professed religious. And finally, or no, not finally, but third, they were obedient to the Roman Church. This became especially complicated during the Great Schism and in times when the Church banned the performing of communions. But these brothers and sisters of the common life were bound and determined to be faithful in the midst of their unique expression. Finally, they committed to live together in humility, love, and the pursuit of the virtues. This may seem like an obvious statement, but the modern devotion was passionate for interior religion, as opposed to mere external practices or observance. Theirs was a religion of the heart, and they were a movement that aimed to foster heart religion for one another. And they took this goal seriously. Education was important to them, and they made great use of the vernacular in teaching locals, holding religious meetings together, and in their writings. They practiced mutual correction and accountability. They prayed a regular office of prayers, usually developed more from the cathedral readings than from the monastic structure. They worked in some gainful employment. The men were often involved in copying books, and the women were involved often in some form of the textile trade. There was time set aside for reading, and there was time for regular self-examination, a practice that was much encouraged among these communities. They also develop ministries of sorts, hosting Bible studies, serving as confessors and spiritual directors to people in general, and training young clergy. A sample customary of a community of brethren offers a helpful view into the life of modern devotion. This customary, which is like a rule, a bit more informal, it discusses the themes to be used in meditation, their hours for rising, their hours for prayer, the study of holy writings, labor, dining, rest after meals, common meetings, mutual correction, the roles and responsibilities of various individuals, the treatment of visitors, and so on. The customary mentions obedience to the local priest, poverty, holding possessions in common, and chastity. The houses of the brothers and sisters of common life were houses of single persons, separated by sex. In many ways, the communities of the brothers and sisters of the common life can be looked at as informal urban monasteries, and yet they took no formal vows, possessed no formal status as a religious order, and had much more external contact with the outside world than most orders. So there you have it, 4 expressions of the consecrated life that bear resemblance to traditional monastic life, but don't match the Benedictine model. They have reconstructed the norms. Take the vows, for instance. First, some of these groups, like the Beguines, made no effort to demand solemn vows on the part of their participants. Stability was not required, and so people were free to leave when necessary. Members of the Humiliate and the Franciscan Third Orders, along with some Beguines, lived in private homes or even with their families. There was no sense of a common dormitory for the entire monastic population, although usually a community would identify a place for holding common meetings, at least. Those for whom active ministry was central might simply repeat the Franciscan dictum, "The world is my cloister." And yet, it is inaccurate to say that these, shall we call them, new monastic expressions, were just a pendulum swing from community and contemplation to action. No, I don't think that's fair. I think they were re-exploring the embodiment of the gospel entirely. With these groups, you see a new mysticism and approach to contemplation. You see new experiments in community, and you definitely see new experiments in action in the world. So, what about their view of poverty? Well, it all depends. All of these expressions valued simplicity, but they expressed that simplicity differently. The Humiliate, if you remember, began out of a desire of someone to abandon all of their possessions and begin again in a context of mutual poverty together. The Franciscan Third Order arose out of the desire of people to follow Franciscan poverty, but who were not able to abandon families and houses and careers, but still wanted to live a simple life. Beguines lived simply, but actually made the judicious use of the money economy to support themselves and others. The communities of the modern devotion more closely resembled the Benedictine model of disposing one's property upon entrance to a community, and then the community having the possessions being commonly owned. So you've actually got a variety when it comes to poverty. We also see experimentation with regard to the Evangelical Council of Chastity. Communities of Beguines were women's communities. There were similar communities of men, though, also known as Begards. But this movement, like the brothers and sisters of the common life, generally separated between men's and women's groups. The Humiliati and the Franciscan Third Orders, however, were designed to make room for married persons. Likewise, with the vows of obedience, you've got a variety. The governmental structures of these groups varied greatly. Beguinages, for example, explored self-government, perhaps further than the rest of them, but none of these groups really ordered their lives as a traditional monastery. And yet, with all this variance from the Benedictine model, the features of what all through these lecture videos I have been calling the characteristics, dimensions of religious life were all present. We can see the formational dimension, or their pursuit of Christ, perhaps most clearly defined in the chapters of the imitation of Christ itself. To describe the spiritual disciplines of some of these groups would require another lecture in and of itself, but suffice it to say that some of these folks took their ascetical practice quite seriously. While they did not commit to vows with the same amount of permanence as earlier monastic expressions, most still made some kinds of lesser commitments to Christ and to one another, demonstrating the intentional dimension of religious life. Most of their rules and their customaries were not formally approved and were designed more generally to serve the local community, much as an Orthodox typicon might be. And yet, they addressed the same kinds of matters as a traditional monastic rule. They saw their whole life as subject to the government of the kingdom of God and the community of faith. These expressions saw their faith not simply as a system of belief or a participation in a local parish or a new moral code. Rather, and I think even more so, they saw their life as Christians as a new way of life. A life that would be demonstrated by sacrificial investment as individuals and as communities. It is assumed by all of these expressions that they would be saying some form of the divine office. All of this, and their deep mystical interests demonstrate that they certainly saw themselves as embodying a life of prayer. And finally, they saw themselves as an alternative culture. Ironically, not only an alternative culture to the world, but also a bit of an alternative culture to the church as it was manifest in their day. So, what I am saying is that in this period of time, you have groups that are growing up that don't match the Benedictine life or the Benedictine model. Indeed, they intentionally pushed back on this model, but yet they still exhibited the key signs of authentic religious life. They were at least semi-monastic expressions. And this is really where it gets interesting today. Two memories. In 2008, I chaired a panel at the American Academy of Religion on new monasticism. I gave the first presentation, introducing the phenomenon, and then other folks offered reflections on one or another aspect of the movement. One woman in particular argued that new monasticism simply was not monastic because its participants were not celibate, and celibacy was constitutive of the monastic life. Now I remember, I didn't say this quite that way to her, but I remember thinking to myself, well, this is convenient and technically correct within some circles, but it misses the point. What we have here around us in new monasticism is a groundswell of people, married and celibate, trying to devote themselves wholeheartedly to Christ as individuals and as communities in new and fresh ways. The question of whether we demand that everybody be celibate or that members hold their possessions in strict common purse, to me, is beside the point. True, our attachments to family, careers, and possessions will affect our ability to serve God in particular ways. But to me, monasticism is much more than just celibacy or poverty. And the point is, I think these wilder expressions in the late medieval period are asking those same very questions. Okay, memory number 2. It was actually before 2008, and I was just beginning to acquaint myself with the new monastic expressions associated with Shane Claiborne, Ruth Bahaus, and the 12 Marks book. I was in those days reading and making some visits and hearing people talk again and again about Benedict, quoting that famous phrase by Alistair MacIntyre about us needing a new Benedict today. Well, but at the same time, I remember telling Sherry that these people didn't know it, but they weren't modeling themselves after Benedict. They actually weren't a new expression of Benedictine monasticism, but rather they were a new expression of Beguine monasticism, or Humiliati monasticism, or Third Order monastic life, or Brothers and Sisters of the Common Life. The housing structure, the government structure, their approach to marriage and vows and poverty, active ministry, much more actually bear a closer resemblance to these informal, more semi-monastic expressions in the late Middle Ages than they do to traditional Benedictine monasteries, or the Franciscan friaries, or even Augustinian houses of canons, which I've not treated here, but will some other day. And here is my point. I am overjoyed that we are mining the resources of the history of Christian monasticism as we find our way through this crazy century. But there are some resources that we ought to be exploring more. Let's take a look at the Beguines. Let's take a look at the Third Orders, the Brothers and Sisters of the Common Life. From folks like these, I think we have a lot to learn. And as we are learning, I hope you have a wonderful day.